program is brought to you by Newsworks in cooperation with the Eau Claire Area School Board. This program is simulcast on WRFP-LP 101.9 FM.
All right, it's 7 o'clock and the board is present. Maynard, are we in compliance with open meetings laws?
Yes.
All right, so Commissioner Harder has let me know that he will not be able to attend tonight due to a personal matter. So if we could call the roll for quorum.
Commissioner Zur?
Here.
Commissioner Bika?
Here.
Commissioner Clements?
Here.
Commissioner Lyons?
Here.
Commissioner Nordine?
Here.
Commissioner Johnson?
Here.
A quorum.
Thank you. Next on our agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. Those that are willing and able, please join. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Tonight we have no members of the public signed up for our public forum, so we will move directly on to our board and administrative reports. We'll start with our superintendent, Mr. Johnson.
Good evening, Chair Nordine, board members, student representatives, and executive team members. Tonight I have 3 items to share. First, I'd like to give an update on COVID statistics since our last board meeting. Schools are typically a reflection of the community. And since COVID positive cases have been lower and 7-day positivity rates have dropped in Eau Claire County, our schools have been noticing a decrease in our numbers of positives and quarantines for both student and staff. This past week was the first full week with students in attendance in almost 1 month, and our weekly levels of student and staff quarantine are low as they were since early to mid-October. Next, we continue to examine and share the daily staff absence data with our system leaders and school board. Today, for example, we had only 24 district staff absent due to quarantine or isolation, the lowest daily number since October 18th. This is very positive news for the district, and we hope we will continue to improve as a school and greater community through winter break. Secondly, I'd like to focus a little on the secondary level this evening for their work and dedication to bringing athletics and activities back safely for our students, parents, and community. I appreciate the leadership and work of District Administrative Liaison Kim Kohler, Tom Fiedler as the district volunteer, and high school administration, especially activities directors Mike Kernstetter and Kevin Thompson for their organization and planning. The school level actronics teams have provided an excellent live streaming experience for the community and their peers in their athletic events as well. I got to watch the North Memorial boys basketball game and a North girls game the past few days. It was really nice to see students participating. It was a brief time when things felt somewhat normal for many of us. Last Monday evening, I enjoyed listening to the Old Abe and Husky bands play outside our area hospitals in a very cold atmosphere. This didn't deter them one bit. They sounded excellent, and I'd like to thank directors Eric Dasher and Scott Hensiak for their willingness and dedication to lead the students. Finally, and sadly, last Thursday, the district was informed that one of our students, James Sullivan, had been critically injured in an accident in the community. James later passed away from those injuries he sustained in that accident. James was a freshman at Memorial High School. As a district community, we're deeply saddened by this tragic accident. At this time, we want to do everything we can to acknowledge and support James's family. I'd like to thank our district crisis team for their help on Friday morning at Memorial. On Saturday and today, our counseling staff at Memorial were available to assist those who needed support. They'll be available Tuesday and the days following the return from winter break for students who need a little extra help processing this terrible loss. Our students should know there are supports available to them by our district crisis team. Please reach out to your child's school office to connect them to these services. Our staff members also have access to support through our EAP Real Living Counselors. I encourage them to seek assistance as needed. We ask that everyone please keep James' family and friends in their thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. For the board president's report, I want to begin by echoing Superintendent Johnson's sentiments on behalf of the board regarding the tragic death of James Sullivan. We all grieve together over the loss of one of our own. As Superintendent Johnson said, we want to do all that we can at this time to acknowledge and support James's family. I also want to extend my and the board's thanks and appreciation to our district crisis and bereavement teams and to all the mental health professionals that we have available in the district. You are an invaluable resource to our students, staff, and families. Thank you for your work at this time and all the work that you do throughout our school year. Related to our mental health needs in the district, I was able to speak last Wednesday with Jody Emerson, the state assembly member who represents the largest portion of ECASD. Representative Emerson contacted me to ask what ECASD's needs were in continuing to operate with COVID-19 and our challenging year. I shared with her the need for more mental health staff in our schools, something that Superintendent Johnson had pointed out as critical during this school year. Also mentioned some forward-looking concerns regarding wireless hotspots and rural broadband, a hold harmless provision for declining enrollment given the pandemic, and the impact of voucher funding on our already strained budgets. Related to our individual item tonight, I also requested action regarding sick leave for staff affected by COVID. Representative Emerson expressed her concern for and commitment to public education at this time. Finally, we on the board continue our work with our coherent governance transition. Work groups for results input and operational expectations have been hard at work. The board is surveying district families and community members for input on our results policies, and our operational expectations are nearing completion of the work group draft. I want to thank Abby Johnson tonight for taking time out of her busy schedule to help us with the financial policies in the operational expectations. And I have made the drafts in their current form available of the operational expectations for comment for all board members and executive team through Superintendent Johnson today. I also want to remind board members that the form for coherent governance questions to be directed to Jan Berg for our January work session is available for you to add your questions to in your Google Drive under the name Questions for CG Work Session 1/18/2021. Thank you. Our next item on the agenda is our Student Representatives Report. Tonight we will have our representative from North High, Zoe Wolf.
Hello, everyone. The students and staff at North are glad to be back on campus. Although it has been difficult to stay attentive being so close to the holidays, it is an improvement from online learning. I can confidently say that almost everyone in the building cannot wait for a much-needed break from school. Today, the 2019-2020 yearbooks were passed out, which gave us all a moment of nostalgia to look back at the happy moments from last year. Also, many organizations are returning to their planned events. Sports are continuing practices, and there have already been a few games, matches, or meets that can be attended virtually through Husky TV. The music department has begun having optional practices after school so the students can interact with each other in a safe manner. And finally, Student Council is hosting a virtual variety show with acts from many talented students at North. All the proceeds from the ticket sales will be donated to student services and then given to students in need for over the holidays. Anyone interested in being part of this event, reach out to me or Kevin Messiar, the Director of Student Council. All donations are greatly appreciated. Thank you all, and I hope you and your families have a happy and safe holiday break.
Thank you. Our representative from Memorial Emory Tool is unable to join us tonight as he has a commitment to another school event. So we now move on to our board committee reports. We'll start with budget development. Abby, I wonder if in lieu of Commissioner Harder's not being able to be here, if you could update budget development's work over the last couple of weeks.
Sure, I can do that. We met once since the last board meeting, and that was last week, and we talked about referendum and kind of looking at the timeline of the outlined referendum campaign and what that might look and what buckets and time frames that budget development needs to hit as far as building a question, if we want to do a survey, and kind of identifying the needs that could be considered for the referendum. So we did that. And then the second part of the discussion was really related to our salary and compensation packages and what does that look like. And so we started the discussion about where are we spending our dollars as far as salary and benefits go, and how does that compare to other districts? And so we meet again on January 6th, and we will continue that discussion. I've been asked to gather some data, and I'll bring that feedback to our January 6th board meeting.
Thank you, Abby. Jim Schmidt is out of the state, but on the call. So Jim, did LEAP meet over the last couple of weeks?
LEAP did meet a couple of weeks ago, and they've been working on, they brought up a variety of issues, including Acres for Joy as a potential new LEAP project. They did a follow-up on the Arctic Zone and their communication plan and their renewal of their performance agreement. And then they also brought forward the documentary theater project and its performance agreement renewal. So they have quite a bit on their agenda.
Thank you. Demographic Trends and Facilities Planning is waiting for results of the APL study to come in, and thus have not met and will be adjourned, I think, until those results come in. Policy and Governance met Thursday, December 10th, and worked on 4 items. We shared feedback and revision suggestions on our proposed equity statement. That work has been incorporated into the document, and we expect it to be approved for review by the full board by Policy and Governance at our next meeting. Policy and Governance also reviewed and approved for board review minor proposed updates to Policy 343.45, Technical College Course Program, the Start College Now program, and Policy 343.46, Early College Credit Program. Those will be on a future board agenda for consideration. Related to our equity and diversity work in our hiring and retention, Kay Marks brought the beginnings of a revised plan for uniformity in hiring and diversity in recruitment for the district, and there were many paths and ideas. Dr. Johnson also shared information used by the university in their hiring process. This is another high impact piece of the equity work that the board and district have committed to, and we look forward to sharing any needed policy revisions with the board. Policy and Governance also worked on revisions to the governance culture policy drafts. We took the discussion from our previous work session regarding meeting decorum in GC2 and made revisions there, and we'll continue to refine that language during our meeting times, acting as the drafting work group for governance culture policies. We will be adjourning essentially over winter break, and our next meeting will be Thursday, January 7th at 1 p.m. Next up is our legislative update. Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, very light update here. Only thing to report that State Senator Alberta Darling, Republican River Hills, has been appointed the new chair of the Senate Committee Education, and she replaces retiring Luther Olson. Thank you.
Thank you. The next order of business tonight is the consent agenda. The board will vote on consent agenda items with one vote without discussion. If a board member wants to discuss any item, it will be pulled out of the consent agenda and voted on separately. Tonight's items are the minutes of December 7th, 2020, minutes of closed session, December 7th, 2020, financial report, November 2020, gifts in the amount of $10,342.26 for the period of November 1st, 2020 through November 30th, 2020. Payment of all bills in the amount of $5,454,562.90 and net payroll in the amount of $3,646,026.76 for the period of November 1st, 2020 through November 30th, 2020. Human Resources Employment Report. Schedule 2021 summer and fall meetings and 2022 winter spring meetings and 2021 capital improvement budget. We now hear a motion to approve the consent agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Let's do a roll call vote.
Commissioner Zur,
Yes.
Commissioner Bika,
Yes.
Commissioner Clements,
Yes.
Commissioner Lyons, Commissioner Nordin,
Yes.
Commissioner Johnson.
Yes.
All right. With the passage of the Human Resources Employment Report, I will turn the floor over to Superintendent Johnson.
Thank you. Donald Keck graduated from the University of Wisconsin Parkside with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering technology. Over the course of his career, Don has been a registered professional engineer with the state of Wisconsin, a certified energy manager through the Association of Energy Engineers, a leadership in energy and environmental design accredited professional with the U.S. Green Building Council, and received a building operator certification through the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. Don worked as a project engineer from 1987 to 1991 for Paragon Systems in Kenosha. From 1991 to 2004, he worked for Consolidated Papers Incorporated in Wisconsin Rapids as a project electrical engineer. In 2004, he began working for CISA 10 as a focus on energy advisor and stayed in this role until 2012. Since 2012, Don has been working for the Stevens Point Area Public School District as the building and grounds manager. Don will be joining the Eau Claire Area School District on January 25th as the Director of Buildings and Grounds. Thank you.
Thank you. We welcome Don to the ECASD community. Next on the agenda is our single item for our single individually considered resolution. That is the COVID-19 days report. I'll turn it over to Kay Marks.
Thank you. So tonight is a follow-up to the presentation from the last school board meeting where we presented options for continuing the Families First Coronavirus Relief or Response Act. And so this is the follow-up to that presentation. So as you can see in the PowerPoint there, it says that this has been updated. So when we move to the next slide, which has to do with our strategic plan, as you know, this presentation has to do with the district's highly qualified staff members. As we move forward, the report that I have for you tonight's changed slightly since the passing, or since it's been placed on the board docs as of last week. I'm sure that many of you know that with the passing of the second stimulus package, there's been a $284 billion extension to the payroll protection program. And with that, new legislation related to the FFCRA is on the horizon. However, with that said, it may still take weeks into January before we know how that new legislation is going to impact public school employees. Therefore, based on conversations and the advice that we have from our district's legal counsel, I'd like to recommend that the board consider expanding the timeline for the current legislation, which is set to expire on December 31st. With this option, the district would maintain the practice set in place by the original and current FFCRA legislation and would maintain that until the new legislation is in effect. This option seems more reasonable than it would have at the end of November, beginning of December, when we started to talk about these possibilities, simply due to the timing of the second stimulus package being passed. In the event that the board chose to expand the timeline for the FFCRA and roll it into January, there'd be no need for the board tonight to approve either option A or option B, or to include the additional language related to the passing of new legislation, as you saw in the PowerPoint presentation at the last board meeting, or the one that was posted in board docs last week. The board's motion, if you chose to go this way, would be to include the following language, which would be to expand the timeline for the current Families First Coronavirus Response Act, or the FFCRA, from January 1, 2021 to the date the new legislation for COVID-19 paid leave is in effect. So before I take any questions, just a little clarification. The idea here is just to keep everybody whole in terms of what we're currently doing, and not to make any major changes or to propose an ECASD paid plan for employees like we talked about 2 weeks ago, simply because we know now that there is going to be money and a plan available. New legislation is coming, and it's, I mean, when we started talking about this at the beginning of December, we were unclear as to whether or not it was going to happen or when it was going to happen. Now the money is there, it's been allocated. Now it's simply trying to figure out where in the document of over 5,500 and some odd pages, the information that pertains to public school employees, where that information is, what that information means, and then what the Department of Labor is going to do with that information as it pertains to the workforce that we're looking to have affected by that legislation. All information that we have indicates that we'd be looking at early to mid-January before we have the finalized legislation that would pertain to our employee groups. And so it was advised that we would look at just going forward with what we currently have, not make any changes, and wait for that new legislation to come into play. So with that, are there any questions that I can answer?
Dr. Johnson?
So by expanding until the end of January or whenever the legislation is passed, for those classified staff who have already utilized their allotment, they don't get anything in addition to, is that correct?
That would be correct, yes. This would actually be something that the board could start to think about, because if I'm interpreting what I think I see in the portion of those 5,000 some pages, I would anticipate that what's going to be rolled out to us in that new legislation is exactly what I'm offering up right now, is just taking away the deadline and rolling it forward and continuing on with what we've had as the FFCRA legislation. I would anticipate, based on the limited amount that we know at this point, that when things are finalized, we will see something very similar to that, with just an extension that goes out, to later in this year. That's kind of what we're looking at this point in time. But again, it's too early to tell exactly what that's going to look like. But we were looking to perhaps start over January 1. It doesn't, at least again, from a cursory view, doesn't look like perhaps that's what the new legislation will look like. It looks like it might just roll things forward. But there's a lot to be determined with that, which is why we're not looking to make any substantial changes to our plan at this point in time, because we just don't know what the new legislation is going to be.
So other comments or questions from board members? Otherwise, we probably do need to act in some fashion on this tonight because the time will run out by January 1st, and if we don't know how the new law is in place, we would have a gap in coverage. Commissioner Lyons.
I'd make a motion to approve the recommendation put forward by K-Marks.
Jay, can you roll the slideshow back of the slide? And
sure, Marissa, that would be slide 4. Thank you.
So Commissioner Lyons, would you want to just read that for us so we can just have that motion as it's written?
I motion to approve the expansion of the timeline of the current Families First Corona Response Act from January 1st, 2021 to the date the new legislation for COVID-19 pay leave is in effect.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I second.
Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, and because this is financial, we'll take a roll call vote.
Commissioner Zur,
Yes.
Commissioner Bika,
Yes.
Commissioner Clements,
Yes.
Commissioner Lyons,
Yes.
Commissioner Nordin,
Yes.
Commissioner Johnson.
No.
Motion carries.
Thank you.
At this time, we will adjourn to our work session. Tonight, we will be working on over the drafts. Thank you for the presenter status. We'll be looking over the drafts of first the board superintendent relations policies that policy and governance has been through and felt okay bringing to the full board. And then with additional time, since we're running a little bit ahead, we can work a bit more on the governance culture policies as drafted. So just like we've been doing in our work sessions, I will open this up to sort of a general discussion. So I'd like to hear, I guess, feedback on your thoughts. Hopefully you've had a chance to read through the proposed board superintendent relations policies. We're not adopting anything tonight. We will have more time to look at these and some, of course, time to look at them once we have the full set of draft policies. But I would love to hear first thoughts. We can either go through one by one or we can just take them as they come. But feel free to jump in without necessarily being recognized. We'll hopefully be able to work that way.
Perhaps we could go one by one.
Okay, so yeah, on Dr. Bika's suggestion, we could definitely go individually. So we'll start with board superintendent relations number 1, governance management connection. Because it's short enough, I'm just going to read it real quick and then I'll open the floor to discussion on it. The board's main connection to the operational organization is the superintendent. The board will direct the operational organization only through the superintendent functioning as the chief executive officer. Comments, questions? I will say the reason that we started with board superintendent relations is because they don't tend to vary much district to district and are kind of boilerplate. So we did not have a whole lot of discussion as we tweaked them in the work group for development. So I'm not surprised. We can move down to BSR 2, unity of control. The board will direct the superintendent only through official decisions of the board. 1, the board will make decisions by formal recorded vote in order to avoid any ambiguity about whether direction has been given. 2, the superintendent is neither obligated nor expected to follow the directions or instructions of individual members, officers, or committees unless the board has specifically delegated such exercise of authority. 3, should the superintendent determine that an information request received from an individual member or from a committee is unreasonable or requires a material amount of staff time, the superintendent is expected to ask the committee or the member to refer such request to the full board for authorization. This policy in no way restricts individual board members from requesting information from the school district through various statutes that allow for requests for public information from individuals.
Is that boilerplate language, or is that did you come up with those number 2 and 3 in particular? I guess for me it's either we don't have any authority or we do, and so I guess should it be more? I have on here, should it be that school board members can can always request instead of this? Because once again, I guess for 2 and 3, there's this I don't know a power dynamic at play here, and I'm not sure that's really the intentions of coherent government, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I'll start just by saying that the 2 and 3 are essentially boilerplate for all these districts. I haven't really changed anything. I think the only thing that I did is I added in this policy that I think is, I want to say Racine. I could go back and look, and it is not my language there either. It is just putting in, it was not every single district had that clause about public information, but I did add that in just to try to be clear about that. But I'll open it up to just other board members to discuss, because I certainly have some thoughts as to how that breaks down, and I can share that, but I don't want to dominate discussion. So any other thoughts looking at 2 and 3?
I think 2 and 3 to me, meaning that it's always, so when the superintendent is directed by the board, it always happens by the board as a whole, that there's an individual can't direct the superintendent.
Would the extension of a board, to follow up, would the extension of the board also potentially be subcommittees of the board, or is it just full board? I guess for me it would be, because then that potentially takes away P&G. It takes away P&G from actually asking for particular information. If the interpretation, as Dr. Biga had just articulated, is, then that would mean that for those of us in different subcommittees, if we're wanting to request, that request would actually have to be made at the full board rather than actually at a subcommittee level. I guess if that's the way it's intended to read, that's fine as well. But I guess that.
Do you mean asking the superintendent for information? Or,
yes.
I don't think it's about. I mean, you can request information. I think committees do regularly, but it's more about directing action. You know, boy, I can see though. I can see where your question came from. Requesting information isn't an action, but making a change in school district operations is what it's intended to capture.
Correct. And number 2 specifically is just talking about directions or instructions. Number 3 mentions information requests, and certainly board members all the time are sending questions and requests to the superintendent and asking, you know, what about this issue? We had, you know, questions going back and forth just today about our COVID-19. And the language is there so that an individual request does not become burdensome, so that it isn't, I think, to constrain, you know, individual board members from putting a heavy burden on staff members or on the superintendent. So, and I think you're probably aware right now that we right now operate, you know, when we need, for example, Abby came to our work group to help with the operational expectations that dealt with financial policy. And we made sure to, you know, go through Superintendent Johnson and say, we'd like, you know, Abby to be able to spend an hour of her time. And then it ended up being some extra time to do some more work, but we wanted to make sure that we were not unduly burdening the district or its staff. And in the event that we had said, we want 40 hours of Abby's time, and it was just, you know, one of us or the work group, which does not have any official delegation of authority, it's just the group of us that are working on these policies, the superintendent would be expected to come say, well, that's a lot of time. You need to discuss this with the full board and make an action, you know, direction. If the full board then directed that time, then that would be different. But it's the.
I actually wonder if I didn't see your. I mean, I hadn't thought of that point, but I see your point now, and I wonder if there would be some value in placing what is currently number 3 to first, so that you know that's focused on information. And then what would become the new number 3, actually giving some examples that really operationalize what does that mean? Follow directions or instructions. It is quite cloudy, isn't it? I don't know what that means now that you've asked that. Yeah.
And when it comes to committees are delegated authority from the school board. There is a section in the governance culture where we will need to define as a board what committees will still stand. Probably in the textbook purist coherent governance, there are no subcommittees of the board, but each board decides what subcommittees they want. So as you look through the districts that we've been using as models, you see a variety of different subcommittees that the board takes on. Some of them are as simple as just a calendar committee that gets together to make sure that they set the work calendar for each year. And then some of them are more in-depth, such as what our budget development currently is and our policy and governance committee. So that'll have to be a discussion when we go through governance policies as to which committees do we want to hold and what authority do we delegate to them at that point. And we can have that discussion as well. But you're right, it would cut out subcommittees that are not officially set in place by the board. The board could always set up a new subcommittee and delegate authority as well.
I guess the other issue, as the communication has gone back and forth on this particular topic, I guess I've never considered, and I don't know how you quantify the amount of time a request will take. So, or request for information will take. And so, I think in the example that you gave, depending on who has to be contacted to dive into numbers and all that kind of stuff, I think that the quantifying piece of it just, that adds an additional layer. But at the same time, I think superintendent has the as it reads, final say yes or no. Thank you.
And the yes or no does just come back to the full board, who can then decide to move forward. It's just to continue to act as a single unit. I think I do like the idea of swapping numbers 3 and 2 there. I think it does add a little clarity, and generally that's what board members look for first anyway, is information rather than instruction.
Tim, can I jump in, or do I need to be called on? I'm very sorry if I'm interrupting.
Sorry, I saw you unmuted there. I think as long as we can handle just jumping in, I think I'd like to do that and make this a little bit more casual during a work session. But if we need to get back to it, so please go ahead and jump in whenever you have something to say.
Sure. Well, I was just thinking about, the results policy feedback that we've been working on, and that was never officially, delegated by the board, the work of that. And so, I certainly felt, and why I requested that you remain on that committee and help me out, was that I did not feel comfortable with the district communication piece of it, because I did not feel that it was very clear, nor did I feel that I had the authority to request of the administration that they disseminate a survey out to our community that we've prepared. And then I had to write an email that was going to go out. And gratefully, you had, done a lot of the base work for it. So I didn't feel, I felt better about it. But certainly as, the junior most member of the board and really not understanding where my boundaries are here, I think had this been the policy in place, I would have felt incredibly uncomfortable requesting that the district put a survey out and then signing an email from the board without that ever going through, proper full board approval. So I do think it's worth a consideration to give it a little bit of meat. But however, going forward, maybe we wouldn't be in a situation, maybe some sort of working group like that would have full, authorization from the board to work on its behalf. I don't know. So, but I do think there's some validity to what Commissioner Beacon is saying, that, to flesh these out a little bit and to give examples of when it's appropriate and when it's inappropriate. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm not certain I want to put examples within the policy itself. But I understand that is a bit of a sort of the board, I don't know if it's board training or if it's learning board culture, and it certainly gets to the relationship, between the superintendent and the board. And I think you already know, of course, Commissioner Sarah, that as we were looking to use the district's email lists and meet with staff, we were always running that by Superintendent Johnson to make sure that he felt that it was And had he not felt that it was, I hope that he would have, and I think he would have, told us to come back to the full board to direct that, like, this is getting too much. So these are the sorts of things that remain. Okay, requests for information and work to be done. The discretion for how that lies is with the superintendent.
Could we infer and ask Superintendent Johnson, does he currently have a threshold and or a request that's would be over the top as you've navigated this, Superintendent Johnson? Are there areas where that potentially are out of bounds for you as it relates to a request?
I guess in my experiences in other districts and working closely with my direct supervisor, the superintendent, it could be a variety of things from any type of, any type of subject matter, whether it's personnel or whether it's staffing or budgeting. I think part of it is just the time for any type of task. For example, it'll be an extreme exaggeration, but if you ask me to place some type of report for information at 5:45 tonight and ready at 6:45, and I guess that would be an egregious example, but what I've appreciated by the board since we've had these discussions in the last month or two, and more specifically, where you have asked me for permission, and I would say, absolutely, please reach out to that staff member that I may supervise or indirectly supervise, and please share with them that, you have worked through me on this. And I would have to say in every example, there has not been an example where I feel the things that you've asked me have been a typical request of a school board or a school board member or even a smaller committee. I think the main thing, like I said, and going back to this, would be the time or the type of task and the amount of time it might take.
So he has a 60-minute threshold before a meeting, or an hour. No, that's a bad joke too. Yeah, bad joke. So I think it was an hour and 15. Yeah, that's your compromise piece. If we were to reorder, as Dr. Bika indicated, could I also access it? If you're not interested in putting examples, could it be delegated such as exercise of authority? So unless the board has specifically delegated such exercise of authority, meaning subcommittees, could that at least be put in there or not? So where two officers or committees, unless the board has specifically delegated such exercise of authority, that includes or i.e. say subcommittees of the board, or no? So
committees you don't feel satisfied with just the word committees being in there?
Because I guess I
could add subcommittees.
Well, given Commissioner Zer's example though, was that a committee recognized by the whole? And so given Commissioner Zer's example, I would actually say to Commissioner Zer, if this policy was in place, Commissioner Zer would actually not be in compliance.
Sure. I don't think that says anything about what the board can do. Commissioner Zer can ask the superintendent, and sorry, we're not using you as an example other than you spoke up with your own example, Commissioner Zer. Commissioner Zer can say to Superintendent Johnson, both, I want X number of hours of the time of Abby for this work, and you have to change it to, there's nothing that's out of line. I mean, it's inappropriate, but it's nothing out of line in terms of the policy. It's the superintendent's responsibility to then say, that is not the role of the individual board member. If you want those things done, I need to have the approval of the entire board. So I don't think it puts anybody directly out of line by, if they overstep their authority. This is giving the superintendent the power to say to the board member, you are I believe you're overstepping your authority. please bring it back to the full board for direction.
So in my example, just to come back to it, had Superintendent Johnson said, I'm sorry, but sending a survey out to the whole district regarding the results policies has not been approved by the full board. I would like full board approval on that before we move forward. That's really what this policy gives him the power to say, because it was not specifically directed by the board that we do that. Not that it really just gives him the discretion to do it, correct?
Right.
Not that I would be out of compliance, just simply that it would give him.
It puts some boundaries in place for individual board members. Now, our board, in my experience, has not pressed up against any of these boundaries, whether in this process, and maybe and it doesn't sound like Superintendent Johnson feels that we have either. But you hear about when board members in other districts, going in and demanding different changes or different models or different policies, and individual board members are not entitled to do that. We don't have, and that's actually in our current board code. So this is not a real big change from the current board code.
Something that might be, you might be talking about two different things. If you, and even especially for new board members, I don't think you would have even seen that. And we asked when the Eau Claire School Board has engaged in self-evaluation process, you probably haven't seen past self-evaluations, but in those evaluations, one of the top areas is speaking with one voice. So I think two things might be happening. That this is about how the board directs the superintendent, but I think this school board has had challenges in the past, and I don't know if we still do or not, because we haven't engaged in self-assessment with the current group, but has had problems speaking different voices. But that's when you're out, not directing the superintendent, but when you're communicating broadly with others. We haven't always spoken with one voice. I do, though, if I may say, I would like to see some examples, not general examples, I think could go a long way in this number 2 overall, because I think it helps people to understand, are we talking about the example of requesting information? If that could be clarified, or are we talking about some other kind of directive?
Having two of you now ask for some examples, I don't necessarily have a strong. My consideration was more about trying to keep it as lean as possible. Although we'll see when we get to some of the other ones that lean is not always where we end up. So I don't necessarily have an issue with providing some of those examples. I'm a little bit at a loss as to what examples I would put in, only because I've been drafting this and sort of living in this mindset for a long time. So I don't have the right frame. I would be happy to get some examples or just even some additional draft language to add in there and bring back. Right? Whether that's Dr. Bika, you or Commissioner Zur or any of the rest of you. I think if we can clarify it for ourselves, and then that also probably then would clarify it for future boards as well.
Tim, is this perhaps better suited under, where did you have it? Under the governance culture, under training, where you had requested that maybe we need to flesh out what it means to actually train board members. And I'm just wondering if that is a better suited place for examples. I mean, not that I think it's right. I think, I certainly, coming in on June 1st in a pandemic with an outgoing superintendent, I got very little in the way of training or, it really anything. So, certainly I think making sure that that is consistent and strong with strong, examples of what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. I would advocate for that. And maybe that is a better space within the coherent governance policies to have examples of this. If you're specifically concerned about this one, and we can add meat in a different spot, but certainly I think that understanding a bit more what is meant by this language would make me more comfortable as a board member.
I think my feeling is that wherever the ambiguity is probably the right place to put some of these examples. I feel like what you're asking for, maybe Dr. Bika, what you're asking for is, well, give me some examples of what kind of examples you'd want to see in there to help to clarify what these two clauses mean.
I suppose an example could be following direction or instruction, say, to make curricular change.
Okay. So you would, to try to elaborate on it, so you would perhaps see a couple of examples of sort of what a direction or instruction from an individual board member might look like. So in some sort of a don't do these. Is that kind of what you're looking for as well? What you might think of as well, commissioners, or say, such as a particular instructional change or.
Yeah, I mean, I guess where my question came up was just in this example. Like, I feel like I've kind of, lived a moment of this where I spoke on behalf of the board without the authority of the board. Technically, I did. And, the Superintendent Johnson could have very well had said, no to me at that point, or, requested that it come back before the board utilizing this policy. Now, the reason why I very much requested your involvement in that, as president of the board, was because I felt very uncomfortable in that role of, communicating out with the district on behalf of the board. And so, I guess that is where I'm coming from. Is just that speaking on behalf of the board without directive of the board, that's really where I'm coming from. Like I did direct technically the superintendent to do something that he could very well have said no to. So, certainly communicating out with communicating with the district as a whole is the situation that I come from personally. But I could see where there's other situations that could arise where you would feel discomfort. But because I haven't lived them or seen them, I guess I don't have as much to add. But and I don't know how specific the examples have to be. But I guess, I don't feel so much ambiguity anymore, because I just understand that this would just be the superintendent's ability to say no or to ask for the board to approve it.
I think I can help slightly here. I think of two things in the 5 to 6 months I've been here serving the district. I do believe that I've had requests from each board member about a question, or Mr. Johnson, could you help me understand this, or a type of request. I think number one is timeliness, and number two is the type of matter or subject matter you're asking about. And every time that I've had the board ask an individual question, now granted, I go back to the Sun Prairie board member's presentation for us this past summer, and like Lori Bika had stated, the board acting as one is, that's most preferable. That's how the board should act. However, there are many questions that board members would have. I think number one, I illustrated before, would be timeliness. There are certain types of things that Our executive team is extremely busy, but yet, for the most part, I may just ask them, how long would it take to do this type of a report? Or to give me this information? You know, Mike, it would take us quite a while. Well, then I'd share that with the board member or members of the board, and everybody's been very appreciative. The second would be the type of subject matter, and Commissioner Zur, what you had brought up before, you know, this is the work that we're trying to impact our district. I think it's centrist to what's on my evaluation, what the district's goals are, and that's why I obliged, but I did have a couple questions, and you know, tried to ask other questions that would make it a little bit easier, or acknowledge that timing wasn't perfect on one item, and just asked for your thoughts on that, and you were fine with it. I think it's time and it's subject matter. If you were to have asked me about a survey of, let's say, tennis nets, I don't think that would be an appropriate, you know, use of our time. But the survey that three members of the board had asked, that we need that feedback from our parents, our staff, that is pretty important. But if it were a concern from another staff member that I directly or indirectly supervise, I would certainly share that with the board to say, let's either give some more time, or let's go to the full board for more clarification and what was needed.
So by way of a little consensus on this, what I'm hearing is maybe flip-flopping number 2 and number 3, put the information request first and the direction second. And then adding examples potentially to what's currently number 2 to designate some things that might constitute an inappropriate direction. Commissioner Lyons, Commissioner Clements, we haven't heard anything from you, and Dr. Johnson as well. What are your thoughts on adding the examples and the flip-flops to see where we are? I'm not, you know, I'd like to have us all kind of on the same page.
I think changing the order is good. I'm, I guess, a little more ambivalent about adding examples or not. Like, the pros and cons, like you said, but we were aiming for conciseness, and examples invite further muddying, perhaps. So, you know, if there are examples that board members think that are on target, that really capture the unity of control that they're desiring to describe, then I'm, you know, supportive of that. But I think, you know, we can keep going and finding new examples where perhaps there's some fuzziness. And frankly, it's kind of up to the board, each individual superintendent, to figure out where that kind of line exists.
Yeah, I would agree with what Commissioner Clements just said. I think these are very high level. I think that by adding examples, you start to define them. And I think that they're really meant to be interpreted. And I think that they should be flexible. So I think that as situations arise, that these are to give guidance and direction, but not necessarily to very specifically define.
Yeah, I guess after listening to what Superintendent Johnson said, I think that superintendent, and please, Superintendent Johnson, I don't know that I would, you know, hope that you will stay with us for a very, very long time. But, you know, every superintendent, I think, is going to have a different definition or at least a comfort level, especially as they get going, you know, with how this is going to be interpreted. So either we rein it, either we put the, you know, the guidelines on it now, that, we want all boards to have, or we just leave it, a little bit vague. And then, ask that of our superintendent, either in an interview process or as you're moving along and getting to know them, where is your comfort level with communication from the board? And I think every board's going to have to feel out, every board's going to be different. Every superintendent's going to be different. And the situations are going to be different. So I guess in thinking about what Commissioner Clements and Commissioner Lyons has said, I would support leaving this vague. However, more of those higher, I guess if I were to see any examples in there, it would be something more higher level, like Superintendent Johnson was saying, like timeliness, relevance, right? As in relevance, as in, the work of the relevant to the, overarching work of the board and the district. That type of language, not necessarily specific examples.
So where I feel like we're now at is flipping 2 and 3 and leaving the language more or less as it is, as a general consensus. Dr. Beek, I want to give you another chance to talk about it because you were asking for potentially putting some examples in there or other language.
Yeah, I'm trying to just use that lens of a brand new board member. What does this mean? How do I understand the way I'm to interact?
What do you think about, commissioners? There's consideration that maybe we try to set a fairly strong training program for new. Now, I don't know whether that's in our capacity or not, but that would certainly be a potential place. It may not avoid some corner cases like the one that Dr. Johnson and Commissioner Zern, no doubt, experienced coming in a pandemic and in a time of transition, and probably Commissioner Clements, for that matter. You were elected but not seated too long before our transition. I can also put a flag on this to come back as we consider it. We don't have to make any decisions tonight. I can put in just a note in there to continue.
I did have a question about that, the short little paragraph at the end.
Okay.
And it surprised me, I guess. I would have never considered as a board member that I should be requesting information. And I don't actually know if there's any different, are there different mandates or expectations for board members versus non-board members when requesting through that public information? Like I said, I was a little bit surprised that I was trying to imagine what that would be like. A board member who regularly requested information through through the public records. What would that be like? And are we held to different expectations?
Certainly, we've had discussion in P&G, and I think in our operational expectations working group about, individual variances in district policies often come up because there was an issue and the board decided to revisit and deal with that and put it in policy. And so the way that I envision that this is then in the situation where the superintendent and the board do not have a good relationship or a particular, and the superintendent regularly uses this sort of policy to say, that's too much work. We won't provide that information. We, get the whole board to do it. In this situation where it would be, say, a Freedom of Information Act, then the board member could certainly use that as a member of the public. I would suspect that in the self-evaluation of the board and looking that there's some dysfunction there. I felt as I read through it and saw it in the one that was sort of clarifying to say, hey, every member of the public still has access to use these things. but it is not in everyone, and maybe there is that expectation that the board and the superintendent will have a different type of relationship and that reasonable requests will be there. But that was just my thinking on it, and I have no strong feelings about that particular clause one way or the other.
So if I may, and this is just a statement, does not require, any further conversation, but given the inclusion of this and what you just articulated, then there's really the authoritative power or proposed authoritative power of the superintendent saying no. As a citizen, as a board member, I still could actually get the information.
Being on the board does not change any of our rights as citizens to access information. You hopefully wouldn't have to resort to it, and maybe it's one of those things that we remove until such a time where there is a problem. I certainly would not expect any of us to need to use that particular thing, but
I'm always bothered though by the subjective nature of policy not really holding form when it's based on the relationship of the members who are supposed to abide by. So that's interesting. Always open for debate, but I think we're at a good spot.
all right, so maybe we'll move on to number 3. Just as an overall question, is it helpful for me now, or have you all had the chance to read them and you sort of have your comments preloaded? Okay, so then I'll dispense with reading them each as we go. And comments and questions or items on number 3, staff accountability. Go ahead.
I wondered if for number 3, could we imagine any scenario in which, say, having a board member on a search committee, for example, would be an advantage? I think because it's current, I really don't know the answer to that. But the current number 3 takes board members out of any possible personnel.
One draft of this that we went through in P&G did have an additional little clause there for superintendent request to have board members involved in one of these. I don't know if Commissioner Clements or Dr. Johnson, if you'd like to talk, or Superintendent Johnson for that matter, if you'd like to talk about sort of how we sort of discussed that and landed on not having that in there.
If I recall our conversation correctly, President Nordin, is that we wanted to make it clean that the board is only responsible or only provide oversight to the superintendent, and then we use our evaluation policies to guide the governance process rather than again making that line perhaps too fuzzy or creating exceptions for ourselves to potentially be involved in a recruitment besides the superintendent. So I think that captures the essence of how we discussed it, because we did in P&G discuss opportunities where it might be beneficial, and board members do have certain expertise perhaps in perspectives, but since hiring any person other than the superintendent is not the board's role, we didn't want that to be seen as somehow being involved in the operational aspects of staff.
Yeah, I think the other piece is just the overall power differential. that potentially, exist. And, I think for some of us, who, don't feel like we have the power, but we're told that we do. So that influence of not being a part of that. So, yeah.
Other items or comments or questions for BSR 3? All right, BSR 4 is the authority of the superintendent. It sort of lays out, I would say, what the crux of coherent governance is that the board focuses on the results for the district and sets up some boundaries with the operational expectations. Comments and questions?
I guess for me, for 4 and 5, but for both 4 and 5, as we're going through this, I would anticipate that our results and operational expectations really need to be unique to Eau Claire, but also in alignment to where we want to go as a district. And, because the reference throughout both 4 and 5 to results and operational expectations, if we don't really have a lot of detail there, I don't think that really lends itself to to any sort of effective accountability for all that's involved. And so, as I was reading those, I was like, oh man, we need to see the results and operational expectations, but we're also still developing those as well. So.
It certainly does come down to how strongly we feel about those two policies. I think regardless of what the end product there is, this will not change. I mean, this is the focus, but you're right. This does put the onus on the board and future boards to develop and continue to refine those policies in a way that they feel that they can adequately measure them. And you can see in the example policies for the results that there's a wide difference between levels of specificity, but that's up to an individual district's board to decide where to put those. But I think you're right about that.
I would echo that. So me, just in my own comments about the results policies, I like them wordy and detailed. That's just going to be my nature, I think. But I think that this has to be what we own, is this part of it. You know what I mean? The board has to feel passionate ownership over the results and the expectations that we set forth in this district. Everything else stems from that. So, I think when we look at how we're going to govern ourselves and how we're going to relate to the superintendent, it has to be in passionate defense and advocacy of those two bolded, topics right there. And so, it kind of all comes back. When we're looking at the final package, hopefully next spring, this part is going to feel like this part's going to feel more like our, the platform on which we will stand, right? Like we will stand up here, and these are the things that we're going to say from the top about all of these amazing things that we're protecting underneath. So I agree that to view this now without seeing those things is really hard. That's how I felt when I read it. Is just like, yeah, this is exactly what I would want to say or stand on if I felt really passionate and I felt really strongly that those were the right things for our district, and the right things that our ownership, I guess, would ask of us. So you know, I would feel much more comfortable commenting on this when I have a better sense of what our community wants to see in the form of results, and what, you know, how we feel as a board is the best way to organize our expectations. But I don't have any problem with this as it's written.
And this is why we adopt the policies in omnibus form rather than saying we're going to do this and then not coming up with something good at the end. So I can understand that.
I have two questions on this one. The first, for number 2, I think to always begin with, there's an interest in keeping it short. I think you could actually, number 2, just keep the first sentence and probably delete the next 2 sentences. Because when everybody knows what those operational expectations are, it will be obvious and it will be worded in different ways. So I offer that, unless there was a reason why you felt that you had to really draw people's attention to that.
It's just the way that it's in the, I think it's in the example policy from good governance as a choice, and it's stated that way, I think, in all of the district policies. But I think you're also right that should go without saying if you look at the operational expectations. I'm all for taking out words that are not necessary. Others thoughts on that idea? Number 2 would then simply just read, the board will develop operational expectations policies which express the board's values about operational conditions and actions.
Agree.
Can I just ask a question about that the prohibitively part of it? So there can be things that we expect to be done within the operational expectations, but then there's also, I haven't read them. I know you just sent them recently, but I mean, other than like a long time ago, but but then we can state them. So it's obvious that they can be both expectations of action and prohibition. Yes. Yeah. We don't have
so Commissioner Lyons and Dr. Vika and myself have been doing the drafting on the operational expectations. We've been working hard to keep as many of them framed as positives. So under any given one, it might generally lay out the policy, and then it says, the superintendent will, and then it lists the things that the superintendent will do. And then where it is appropriate or where we've not been able to find an additional way to keep it as a positive, it then goes to a separate section that says specifically the superintendent will not. So they're very clearly laid out in terms of whether the superintendent may or may not enact a particular option. And I don't expect anyone to have looked at them today. I've been holding them until we had more of them in there. So the drafts are not complete throughout all of the operational expectations, but there's enough there that we felt like it was worth sharing out for people to be able to look at their convenience. So
yeah, that's
sure.
Fine. If it's obvious, then I'm fine. I'm fine with removing those sentences.
Okay. Then you had a second question, Dr. Vika?
Yes, thanks. My second question is in number 3 about the board making the final determination about interpretation, reasonable interpretation. And this idea about the superintendent's interpretation comes up now in multiple, ESRs. And I wondered if we could maybe kind of look at that as a whole. So you have to go quite far into the document before you get to this mention of a reasonable, the quote, reasonable person. And I don't know what that is. And I'm sure it has use, but if it could be defined and perhaps introduced in the very first BSR where we're talking about a reasonable interpretation. But I know just when I landed right here as the first thing I read, I felt very uncomfortable. I imagined myself being a superintendent. You know, the board makes a final determination. I don't know how they're doing that.
I mean, I believe, and that might actually be a great question to put in for our question and answer session with the forest. President Berg has said that she's going to bring at least one of her colleagues along, so we'll have two perspectives from their board on how that works. But I think that would be a great, how does that reasonable person standard function? How does your board decide whether the superintendent? I mean, it's meant to be. What did the board envision when they put this particular operation, or how does the current board envision this particular operational expectation to occur?
So I thought about this unfolds, you know, over the course of the year. Well, I'd like more explanation up front. So like, this is the very first time it's stated, and we know almost nothing about what it means. And then we learn more, you know, as we read along. But the board making the final determination, is that a collaborative process where the board and the superintendent actually work together to operationally define reasonable interpretation? Or as the you know, the presentations and the evaluation happens over the course of the year, how does the superintendent learn if they are engaged in reasonable interpretation? When do they find out? Or, you know, it's really murky to me. So.
I think that'll definitely be part of the learning process for how that happens. I know when you look at examples of what a monitoring report might look like, the superintendent will bring, there will be a section on interpretations. And so the superintendent will present, this is how we've interpreted the language in the various clauses and subclauses to go through. And then that part of that presentation would be then, you know, assessment by the board and discussion. And I imagine if, hopefully it's not just coming out at that point that this is the interpretation, that perhaps there's been, you know, some informal back and forth saying we're a little concerned that this is the way that this is going. But I envision it being a collaborative process where we're then talking about, you know, well, you know, this really is not what we feel is a reasonable interpretation of this. And then the board has to decide, does the policy need to be rewritten to explain that? Or does the superintendent just, you know, make some changes in the interpretation? But you're right, I don't have a great answer. I'm sort of just envisioning what it will look like.
Well, it would potentially be all for naught though, because if you jump down to number 4, I guess the issues that I have is the board may change its results and operational expectation policies at any time. So potentially it would be all for naught, because, you know, we could change it if we don't like where it's going. We could change it. If we don't like what the superintendent is bringing or the superintendent's interpretation, we can change it. So it's, yeah. I mean, there's really, I guess for the coherent piece of this, there's a lot of power differential or dynamics going along here, which is, I don't know, counterintuitive to that idea, unless it is informing continuous communication between board and superintendent. If that's the underlying intention, then I get the gist of the power differentials that potentially are at play with some of them.
I think there's this propensity that we're stepping into to be fearful that you know, or protect the board and protect the district, you know, against sour relationships with the superintendent, or, you know, to protect the superintendent against, you know, potentially sour relationships with its board members, for whatever reason that could be. But again, I think this just comes back to what I was saying earlier of, you know, we're writing this as this board in this moment, in this time with this superintendent, with the goals that we have right now. In 5 years, none of us may be here. You know, so I think that we have to keep some policy rather vague and interpretive. And then, you know, for example, was it when Demo and Trends presented and asked for authorization for the data gathering? And was it Commissioner, I think it was Commissioner Bika said that, you know, they would just prefer that not come before us anymore. You know, that was a moment where I think the board said, hey, you know what? It's reasonable that you would do this without asking our approval. Please just do it. So I think there's going to be moments where those boundaries are going to be established. And I'm sure that Superintendent Johnson just was like, oh, well, there's certain things they're really going to just trust us to do, and we don't need to bring it before them. And I think every board and every superintendent is going to have to work that out, you know, depending on who is sitting there. And, you know, so I'm okay with some ambiguity as long as there are certain things that are very not ambiguous at other points, if that makes sense.
So Dr. Bika, to talk about this, thank you, Commissioners or Dr. Johnson, for your input. To talk about the specifics of what you're talking about the reasonable standard. I will once again say in this section, almost nothing is free written. It is all just sort of boilerplate cut and pasted from. That does not mean that we can't switch things around by any means, because this is our process. But would it be, so you had talked about maybe putting it even in the first one about a definition of the reasonable standard. If you look at the language there, I haven't looked back at it to see if that would be a good fit. Could it also work in that? I'm sorry for jumping around on this screen. It could also work, I think, if we just put in that number in what would it be, BSR 4.3, where it first talks about the school board having the final determination about whether such interpretation is reasonable. We could put right there a discussion as well, or there a discussion of the board will use the reasonable person, and then we could put a reference in there if we wanted, or write it out. Would you see that as being helpful language? Would you like it? Would it make more sense there right in 3, which is the first time we talk about the board being, or would you want it somehow in the very first policy?
Oh, I just meant the first time it was discussed.
Okay. So just adding a little bit in 4.3 there about reasonable person. So right, sort of, you know, the board will make the final determination as to whether any such interpretation is reasonable, and then maybe I could draft some language, but something along the lines of the board will use a reasonable person standard as defined. Thus, would that feel all right to you?
Yeah.
Potentially.
Because it's stated pretty definitively there at the end, you know, will apply the reasonable person standard.
Sure.
But we don't know what that is.
Fair enough. So unless there's any objections, I don't have a problem with adding some of that language in there in 4.3. Were there other comments and questions about number 4? And Dr. Johnson, you might be right that looking at 4 and 5 together do make sense, but specifics for number 4? All right, then let's jump down to number 5, where it does lay out superintendent accountability, how the board monitors the results and operational expectations. Comments, questions, considerations here?
I would just like to know where so if we go down to 5.7 here, is it pertinent to have actual identified months? Because I guess the influx of when hiring and would come in and evaluations would come in. So is it important to say by January? Is that like important to have in there? Or could it be agreed upon timeline between board and our superintendent? Because I would assume, given where Superintendent Johnson came in, we would not be able to like meet this mark. And would a board, depending on when hiring took place, would they be able to meet specific? And are you beholden to that? Is that there just for show? There's some flexibility, or I guess rephrase it. What's the consequence if it's not done by January?
So what happens in my understanding of what happens in a coherent governance, and this again could be something that we bring up in our question and answer session, is that we'll have this annual work plan, right? It's delineated, and annually, it's sort of like we have now, right? When we go to agenda setting, Meta says, here's what's on our annual work plan that we need to make sure we tick off in December or in January. But annually, we'll have to work with the exec team and the administration on what month is best suited for each of the operational expectations to come for monitoring and for the results, for that matter. Because it probably doesn't make sense to monitor all of your results in September when we may or may not have student achievement data that is going to be necessary for some of those results back yet from the previous year, right? But annually, you'll have, every September we'll monitor these policies. October we do these, and there's essentially a chart, and that's what's listed in 5E. But it's just a link because it literally is a spreadsheet, and you put down monitored in this month, board disposition, meeting with exceptions, not meeting, for example, for each of our results policies. And so at the end of the year, and I've left it as January because we've always done from my understanding, the board has always done its evaluation of the superintendent in January. I know we've got a little difference. In the situation where there was a new superintendent, my guess, and it was, if that new superintendent started in July 1, like Superintendent Johnson did, that in January of that year, the board would evaluate what they had, 6 months worth of, right? And there would have to be, of course, some understanding that the superintendent has not had time to necessarily influence all of these things, but it's an opportunity for the board to express, here's where we've been going and we'd like these things to go. And you just would have a, not monitored, or you would have the results of the monitoring throughout, but the board would have to recognize that this was under a previous superintendent. But it just repeats every year. And I think designating the month is necessary. So this is when we cycle it off, and also with a contract cycle, then the board would be in position to make decisions about contract renewals and whatnot by having it in January. I hope that answers your question somewhat. Please.
So for number 2, you talk about internal, external, and board. I wondered if each of those statements, would it be okay to just end each one after the word progress? In B and C, there's some extra kind of detail there, but I unless you thought that it added something, I thought that they were, because I found myself wondering with the added language, like, how is this different than I thought it was all about? Are all 3 of them really about components and progress? Perhaps they could just end there.
I'm just going to take a moment to read them and think about it. Your question. Anybody else, please jump in if you've got thoughts. I'd say at a glance, I don't see anything that would be a problem with removing those little bits at the end.
One other thing on that little cluster. In the external review, does the external third party have to be selected by the board? Because I thought about, for example, do we select does the board select the actuary? Does it matter that the external third party is selected by the board, or?
Do you think that it has a difference in terms of the board monitoring these policies as opposed to the administration, complying with the statute and then using, so when you say the actuary, I think of like our annual audit, right? The board, I don't think directly selects the auditor. But I guess I see that as being, the district complying with laws on that, and then using that as part of their summary to say we're in compliance with the operational expectations that deal with the finances. So we would not be doing that by third-party review because that's something that they're using. So I wonder if there's a subtle difference between I'm not certain. I'm just on. So if the board wants third-party evaluation of a given, then I would think they would need to decide who they want to do that evaluation for them. This is how I think it sits with me right off the bat. And so I've got several notes of things to clean up based on our conversation here. And I also asked Maida to take especially careful to help for when I get distracted. So I will thank you, Maida, for that work. Are there other comments or questions or concerns or anything that we want to talk about on the board superintendent relations policies? Or we have a little bit of time left tonight, we could switch over to the governance, start on the governance culture.
I want to thank you, Tim, for taking the lead on this. It's a, very heavy lift in terms of reframing this, really crucial aspect of our function.
Thank you. It certainly has been a team effort, and all of you have been heavily involved in different aspects of it. So I thank you for thanks all around, including the executive team and Superintendent Johnson. It's a team effort.
Yeah, I'd echo that, Tim. You really set the framework on this, and it's a good piece of work.
Thank you. That's very kind. So we'll switch over then to governance culture. I asked board members to specifically review GC1 board purpose and GC2 for tonight, and certainly if we had time to go on for more. This is not in the cleaned up formula since we're still in the sort of work group drafting. I've gone through and drafted again, mostly from stock language that's in there, but we can certainly change it. So some of these are, I tried to leave a rationale in there most of the time for others since I was working on someone, so they have some idea of where this came from. But we'll start with GC1 and we'll just do it the same way. I will presume that you can either read it now or you've got some preloaded comments. So comments and questions for board purpose.
I wondered if your group talked about defining community, and I see in the notes that you considered things like the owners, that language, and also stakeholders. I didn't know if there would there be any value to saying, what would you feel, you know, who is the community, or what is the
I'll open that up to the rest of my colleagues. I know this is a question that we've talked about in the operational expectations group too, is trying to move from stakeholders or owners into community and defining that. So what are people's thoughts on how do we want to define our community here, and how might you see that?
Tim or President Nordin, I really appreciate that we're making this reframing, because I think that we need to recognize that the district is of and by the community, and not of, you know, a subset or a objectifying term like taxpayer, or, you know, something like that, where, you know, the community, I think we can define it. I don't know if we need to wordsmith one here, but at the highest level, I think recognizing the schools and the school board and the school district's relationship with our spatial area, you know, and the people who live within it, present and future, you know, is our driving purpose. And you know, I'm happy that I'm not part of the operations policy, obviously, but I'm glad that there's been consistency in kind of that being our purpose, as we're trying to define it.
I think right now we do have some language defining community in our draft of the operational expectations. I want to say it's sitting right now, if you're going to go look for it, at OE5, treatment of the community. But other thoughts or comments on that issue here? Dr. Vega, would you like to see it defined here as well?
I need to think more about that, but I really like, so for Commissioner Clements talking about, it's not just, you know, it's not just the taxpayer, it's not just, you know, particular groups, it's everyone. You know, the idea of, you know, I mean, I love that as a vision. Yeah, I guess I do find myself wanting like a really inclusive, like, this is the community, we embrace all of these people.
I could, I don't know that our, you know, definition that we have it in the OEs is, you know, finalized, or it's exactly right, but I could certainly just port that language once again, you know, and have it shared in the two. Why don't I put a note in there on that community, and we can continue to let it settle a little bit, and we can always come back and it will be easy to add if we want to. Did you have other points on this one? Any other comments or questions for GC1? And I'll take this time to reiterate, as Commissioner Zur was talking about earlier, like we may have a different view of it all when we have the whole thing to come together, but I think having a baseline understanding of it now, rather than trying to look at 60-some pages of policy all at once for the first time, I think having this, but we will have, of course, more time to come back, and we'll have it all out for public comment and sharing before it's approved, of course. So let's drop down into GC2. At about 10 minutes, we can kind of look that up. If you'll remember from last time, GC2 was the one that we looked at for board meetings, and I'm going to skip right down to number 4 here. This is what we had some discussion in P&G with, and recategorizing them using Commissioner Zur's suggestions for the different ways that they fell out. And we've kind of gone through and done some of that. But this is quite long, so I imagine that there's quite a bit potentially here. for people. I'll start just by saying we do have the training item here, and we were talking about that earlier. Some of the sample districts do have some specific items described, providing specific books, and of course we have some of that as well, and different trainings, but I didn't have a good sense just on my own as I was writing these the first time looking at these samples of what the board might like or think would be, walk that line between rigorous and helping board members to be prepared and to be effective as soon as possible, and onerous for either the district or the new members. But I'll open it to any questions or comments.
I guess for me, it's just kind of, you have it highlighted, and hopefully you have it highlighted for the same reasons, but 3C and number 8, I don't see how they're different. And then I guess the other piece to C, the 3C and number 8 under GC2 is what do you envision public trust being indicative of? Because I guess if we're saying maintain public trust, there also is the ability that actually there's distrust in the public as well, as it relates to what the district is doing. Right?
Well, I think you don't have to serve in any public capacity long to know that there are people that have both positive and negative experiences on almost every issue, and I would guess that would, a positive experience might help you to generate positive levels of trust, and a negative experience might cause you to move more towards distrust. I'm just speculating. For the easy one, yes, they're both highlighted. 3C and 8 are highlighted because I took, in some places it was just as a number 8 as its own separate thing, and in other places it was folded in within 3. So I wasn't sure where I wanted to put it, and I left it at both and highlighted it to bring that up as something to talk about. So that's why they're both there, because they are not functionally different. It's just a matter of where does it fit best.
Yeah, like I said, I think that the public trust piece, and then that open communication, but also realizing there are some things based on legality issues that are really can't be openly communicated. So that's back at 3C, through full and open communication. Not all communication can be full and open, and it's really situational, dependent. So, does that need to be in there as well? So I'm just not. I'm not sure. I guess I'm uncomfortable with that whole piece there. But yeah, it's.
Are you saying you'd rather just remove C and or 8 entirely and not have a piece there about expecting the board to communicate with the public?
No, I would say I would probably stop at the community piece. That's for me. So that for me, that's where I'm at. So
so just eliminating the maintaining public trust through full and open communication is what you're saying. You would like that language. Okay.
I'm going to dive into this too, because I think the two components highlighted here, both bullet C and then down on, was it number 8? And then also on GC3, I think it was in bullet 3, two-way dialogue with students and parents, citizens, as a means to engage all stakeholders, that component as well. I think this is the thing that I feel like is the crux of everything that we do here, is if we are the trustees of our community, and however we choose to define that, I think, is great, but representing that community, and we don't actually have anything, we can talk a real big game, yeah, we're going to do this, but if we don't actually say what we're going to do and how we are going to do it and the spirit with which we're going to do it, I could be very passionate about engaging the community in X way. I could go on my Facebook and engage the community in X way. but that creates no consistency. There's no thread. It can leave. So for example, if the group that has formed around the results policy work, which is incredibly diverse and linked in with parts of our communities that are underrepresented and underengaged as a rule within our structure. If I were to not be on the board next year, would that be so I'm thinking there needs to be some sort of community linkage plan, and it needs to be codified. It needs to be written down. It needs to be articulated, not just a list of, yeah, we'll do some surveys and some focus groups, but I'm talking about, I think coherent governance runs the risk of talking a bigger game than it actually shows up with. So for our community, from a community perspective, and I think this is where I don't know what that looks like. I don't know if any other districts have that in their policy, but certainly some of the reading that I've been doing about where coherent governance can fail, this is the big one, is that if you don't actually deliver on this community linkage, I'm just going to call it that because that's what I wrote down, but that part of it has to be strong, and just saying that we're going to do it and not saying how or in what way and with what spirit and in what time frame we're going to be doing that. I think we run the risk of alienating our community because of the inherent fluctuation of a public board. So, I would like more clarity into what communication from the board to our community actually looks like. And what is the spirit that we actually go into that with, and the actions that we go into that with. Now, whether that's a committee or a set of, I have no idea where that fits, but that's what stuck out to me in these first three, I guess, GC policies.
So I'll just answer the easy bits. What you see is that I have not cut out a lot from our sample, and really anything in these parts from our sample districts. In terms of a more formalized plan, like I think you're expressing a desire to see, Commissioner Zur. That doesn't mean that other districts don't do that or don't have that, to my recollection, and I guess I could go back and check, there's not a whole lot more specific. I think and I think you bring up something that's worth some discussion about how much do you prescribe for how the board has to operate in this regard, and how much do you leave to interpretation. I think there's a lot of discussion, and that maybe is one of our next discussion points that we need to have in a work session, just because I think we're running a little short on time tonight. So I think there is a lot of discussion that we could have there, but in terms of easy bits, and I think, so I guess the way that you just talked about wanting to have what's the spirit is that we operate, I would hear you almost disagreeing with removing now granted, we can work on the language, but the idea of removing the part about maintaining public trust through full and open communications. To me, that does speak to the spirit in which the board is supposed to communicate.
I don't know if that necessarily, I think that's just a little too highbrow for me, maybe, but the thing that sticks in my brain is that when I, as a board member, have reached out to certain communities in this district just recently and have been told that this is the first time in a 20-year career that the school board has asked them for their opinion, has asked them for their feedback, we're doing something wrong. That's not right. So
you're doing something right because we're going to seek it.
I feel like yes, now, but that's because we have a very prescribed goal in mind. And so I'm saying, I think that we have to prescribe some sort of plan, some sort of goal, if we're really going to be the people who are entrusted, with this very precious, institution. We need to be constantly hearing from our community and in a more inclusive way, because the things that I have heard consistently about how we communicate and in what forms we communicate is it's not always successful and it's not always accessible. And I'm not sure what the answer is. In fact, that's why I'm continuing, we're continuing to have these conversations is how can we be more successful in communication? But I'm just saying that I think we need to do a better job of actually when it says in GC3 a two-way dialogue, and we have a public comment that's just people talking at us and we all sit there and nod and never say anything. When do we have a two-way dialogue?
That's not the forum in which to have a two-way dialogue.
I know, I'm just saying though, but where is that? When is that?
Sure.
So I think that it's disjointed, our communication plan. And this is where I would really advocate for seeing more definition around that.
Did you want to add something, Dr. Regan?
Well, you said listening sessions.
Sure.
The many listening sessions we
have. We are close to the end of the night, and obviously there's a lot more to discuss, and there's a lot of even governance culture to discuss. We'll continue in our policy and governance won't meet until after the next board meeting, but we'll certainly take some of this and try to do some more work on GC2 as we work through. I do want to point out the reason that section C1 there is highlighted in green. That is original language that I wrote and I added there to get at at least a little bit of what you were talking about, Commissioner. So that part is not, that is original that I added in that draft. So we can talk about whether or not it needs to change. That's not an issue, but that's the reason that's particularly highlighted there, because I wanted to point out this is not where I'm just borrowing from some of the boilerplate. So at 8:56 then, and I know there's a lot more to talk about, but I think it's probably best to continue this on another occasion. I envision, anyway. So at this time, thank you all for your work tonight. We'll continue to work through this together as we have more, and your feedback is very appreciated in this process. At this time, I'll ask for requests for future agenda items.
I have two, if I could.
Yep.
Is it possible, Ms. Radke actually sent out a request in terms of instructional model change for second quarter? Is it possible, and I think they requested that parents submit responses by the 28th, by next board meeting, is it possible to get an update of what were the changes, if any, of the request going either way, full virtual and or hybrid? Going into the second quarter, if we could get numbers, breakdowns, grade, school, if possible, if that's not too big of an ask.
Would that be something that would be acceptable to come decide in a memo to the board as well, or do you envision it being a report?
Either way, whichever convenient, whichever way Superintendent Johnson will not say no to the request. So he has the authority to do so. But however, I guess that would be one. And then the other one is somewhat. Is it possible that we could get a report on how students are performing academically in major areas after first quarter comparative to pre-COVID, as it relates to those high stake areas of reading and math? Is that something that's possible to get at, given the fact that grade reports have just gone out across the district, and I'm just curious as to, are there consistencies, are percentages up higher, and are we seeing differences as it relates to students by learning model? And once again, Superintendent Johnson, that request is whichever way potentially that you will not say no, and that we could actually get information from. So
we'll always be able to get the address the board can direct. Anyhow, I want to clarify. We'll look at those things in agenda setting tomorrow. I just want to clarify. You said quarter twice. You said changes to the structural model for second quarter in your first item.
Yeah.
I think in that one you mean semester.
Yeah.
And then do you mean for how students are doing in terms of your reading and math? You also said quarter. Do you mean first quarter, which has ended, or do you mean first semester, which goes a little bit into January, for what you'd like to see?
Whatever they have data, whatever they have data for.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify the language so that when we discuss it, we know, especially Superintendent Johnson knows what the board might be.
So whatever they have, they have data.
Great. Okay. Other agenda items for request. Okay, then I would hear a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Adjourn.
This program was brought to you by a cooperation between Newsworks and the Eau Claire Area School Board. Newsworks is made possible by continuing community support. If you would like to volunteer or make a donation, please contact us via phone at 715-839-5067 or online at valleymediaworks.org.